You think Beauty and the Beast is a children's story? Think again. The version we swoon over in theaters and on storybook covers, the one with polite teapots and a tender romance, arrived after a long line of predecessors that read like adult dramas, bargains that risk a daughter's life, husbands whose faces are never seen, near murder by jealous sisters, trips to the underworld, and seductions by powerful fairies. Taken together, these elements suggest a tale born in contexts of marriage, honor, ritual, and social negotiation, hardly the kind of material you hand to a child without a lot of smoothing. Here's the plan. We'll trace the tale's genealogy through 4 crucial witnesses. First, the ancient model that often sits behind later plots, Apuleius' 2nd century telling of Cupid and Psyche, which contains the classic unseen husband and a series of trials that read like initiation. Then, a startling Renaissance variant from Italy, what folklorists call the Pig King, recorded by Straparola in 1550, where the marital bargain is ugly, very physical, and sometimes violent. Next, the 2 competing 18th century French literary versions, Madame de Villeneuve's long, courtly, and quite adult narrative, 1740-1756, and Madame de Beaumont's shorter, more moralizing retelling, 1746, the tension between them telling us how the tale began to be cleaned up. Finally, a Brazilian oral variant collected by Lindolfo Gomes in the early 20th century, 1918-1939, which shows how elements that look modern in the West persisted elsewhere in forms that retain adult stakes. At each stop, we'll look for recurring motifs: marriage bargains, secrecy in the marital bed, coercion, threats of death, vengeance by sisters, and ask what those motifs assume about who the story is for. First, go back almost 2 millennia. Apuleius wrote in the 2nd century CE. If you know only the romanticized fairy tale version, his story will feel startlingly different. The core narrative, reworked and displaced through centuries, is the story of Psyche, a woman whose beauty provokes divine jealousy and whose marriage is shadowed with rules and danger. In Apuleius, the husband is a divine lover who enters the heroine's chamber by night. Crucially, he forbids her to see his face. The marriage is thus structured around secrecy. The wife sleeps beside a husband she cannot identify, and their union is mediated by the night. This is not a decorative romantic twist. The condition, consummation under anonymity, places the bride in a liminal, instructive position. It prompts questions about agency, trust, and ritualized initiation. When Psyche yields to curiosity and illuminates her husband's face, the consequences are immediate and brutal. Betrayal invites exile, and exile summons a sequence of impossible labors. These are not mere fairy tale errands. Psyche is sent to perform tasks that require endurance, cunning, and the aid or caprice of supernatural beings, sorting mixed grains with inhuman speed, fetching golden fleece, and finally making a perilous descent to the underworld to retrieve a charm-like object. The journey to Hades, literally a trip to the realm of the dead to bring back a box she must not open, is a motif with initiation overtones. Scholars often read these trials as symbolic of rites of passage. The heroine must suffer tests, partake of death in life, and prove herself worthy of an elevated status. Read this way, the tale is less a bedtime romance than an account of social and spiritual transformation, one that presupposes adult concerns about marriage, family standing, and the responsibilities of women within a household and community. Yet it would be a mistake to force a single meaning onto Apuleius. The story also plays out as a critique of the gods. Venus in particular is humiliated, and as a narrative about the dangerous power of beauty and desire. The sisters who deceive Psyche deserve attention here. They are not merely comic foils. Their jealous lies catalyze the heroine's downfall. They point to the persistent motif of intrafamilial rivalry over marriageable daughters. Once again, the plot assumes an audience that understands marriage as a transactional, socially fraught event. This is not nursery room territory. Apuleius ends with a cosmic twist. Psyche is reconciled with her lover, elevated to divinity, and their union becomes a kind of social and religious resolution. But the path to that elevation is a hard, humiliating apprenticeship through secrecy, betrayal, and death-like trials. The presence of nocturnal unions, dangerous vows, and trips to the underworld is instructive. These are elements adults of the ancient world would have recognized as part of marriage's dangerous, transformative power, its capacity to threaten household order and to require ritualized acclamation. In short, the story's machinery looks designed to talk to adults about dangerous adult matters. If that sounds clinical, pause and picture what the motifs do narratively.
They locate the bride in a moral economy where promises can kill, where sisters can conspire to ruin one another, and where the supernatural enforces social penalties. That economy is rarely the target of children's literature as we know it. It treats marriage as an institution that can demand extreme sacrifices, and it treats sexual secrecy not as romantic mystery, but as a form of power and risk. If you're surprised by that, you're not alone. Hit like if this is new to you, and tell me in the comments which detail surprised you most. Was it the nighttime husband, the underworld errand, or that the sisters play such a destructive role? We'll keep going. Fast forward to Renaissance Italy, to a storyteller who will make the marriage bargain grotesque in a different register.
In Straparola's 1550 collection, there appears a variant often labeled the Pig King. This version pushes the tale toward physical disgust and marital economy in ways that feel distinctly adult. The central figure is not a handsome but enchanted nobleman or a divinely secret husband. He is a beast in the most literal sense, a porcine bridegroom whose external form offends the body and the senses. Marriage here is almost a market transaction. A father arranges or agrees to the union under conditions that do not respect the daughter's personhood, and the daughter's feelings are secondary to the bargain. The pigskin, the animal body, and the eventual unmasking or transformation all make the story palpably about bodily shame, sexual repulsion, and the challenge of intimacy in an uncomfortable marriage. Where Apuleius stages tests and divine humiliation, Straparola stages the domestic and the carnal. Brides attempt violent escapes or plots to rid themselves of the monstrous husband. Sometimes wives in variants attempt murder. In one line that recurs in these older variants, a bride is driven by disgust to try to abandon or kill her husband. Violence among adults is part of the narrative's engine. The arc that resolves the animality, through either magical stripping of the skin or an imposed ritual that reveals a princely form underneath, reads as a negotiated reconciliation between appearance and social expectation. The man becomes acceptable not because of his inner virtue alone, but because the narrative makes his body conform. That process, the forced, uncanny alignment of body and social status, assumes adult anxieties about honor, physicality, and the proper management of marriage. Straparola's Pig King is therefore an important data point. It gives us a version where disgust, sexual arrangement, and even attempted spousal violence are not metafictional shock tactics, but narrative mechanisms. The tale treats marriage as commerce and the marital bed as potentially a place of threat. For an adult audience, those matters are immediate and legible. For children, less so, unless the tale is explicitly reframed. By the time the story surfaces in 18th century France, it splits into two slightly divergent literary strategies. On one hand, we have Madame de Villeneuve's longer, more elaborate account, first published in 1740 with an expanded edition in 1756. Villeneuve gives the tale a courtly, aristocratic frame, elaborate genealogies, subplots about seduction by fairies, and an enchanted household populated by servants under spells. Her version expands the social world around the heroine. It introduces seduction as an external threat orchestrated by powerful supernatural figures. It embeds the central marriage within a series of adult social interactions, court politics, inheritance, reputations. Villeneuve's tale is not a sanitized children's bedtime story.
Its texture is social and sexual. Fairy seduction, rival lovers, manipulation by higher powers, and an environment in which honor and lineage matter immensely. Enchantment here is punitive and morally ambiguous. The beast is embedded in adult institutions. On the other hand, Madame de Beaumont's 1746 revision trims that complexity. Beaumont shortens and focuses. The plot tightens around a village girl who goes to live with the beast. The moral lesson becomes clear, and the arc is less about courtly intrigue than about the virtues of patience and inner goodness. Crucially, Beaumont excises or softens some of the more troubling adult aspects. The enchanted servants become less disturbing. The erotic charge of the unseen husband is softened. Beaumont's version reads more congenially as a vehicle for children's instruction. Virtue rewarded, vice punished, and a stronger didactic frame. The contrast between Villeneuve and Beaumont matters because it stages in miniature the transformation of the tale into something more suitable for a domestic, often juvenile audience. Villeneuve preserves adult subplots and moral ambiguity. Beaumont systemizes them into a clearer, palatable moral lesson. This is not accidental. It marks a stage where the story begins to be shepherded toward a younger readership, or at least toward households where moral instruction for young people is a priority. Even Beaumont, though, does not fully erase the story's adult lineage. The motif of the father's bargain, giving up a daughter under social or magical duress, remains, as does the pattern of sisters whose jealousy leads to harm.
These are not mere ornaments. They are social facts that would have resonated more directly with adults who navigated marriage markets, inheritance pressures, and the fragile honor of family members. The sanitized surface cannot entirely obscure the structural assumptions underneath. At this point, it's worth pausing and noticing a pattern. Across Apuleius, Straparola, and Villeneuve, certain motifs recur with telling consistency. Secret marriage and the unseen husband, a nocturnal union where the woman is denied visual access to her partner. Marriage as a transactional bargain, daughters exchanged, often as a result of vows or promises made in desperation. Sibling rivalry with violent consequences, jealous sisters whose actions imperil the heroine. Trials and near-death ordeals, tasks that test the heroine's endurance, sometimes requiring descent into death or other final ordeals. These elements repeatedly anchor the story in adult institutions and concerns: marriage, family honor, social obligation, and ritual transformation. What's striking is how modern children's retellings, culminating in cinematic adaptations, pick and choose from this adult toolbox. They keep the transformation motif, the idea of inner worth triumphing over outward deformity, and they keep the romance element, but they excise or domesticate many of the darker pieces.
The nocturnal husband becomes a mysterious stranger with a sultry yet safe quality. The bargaining element is rewritten as a more palatable sacrifice, motivated by filial love rather than coercive magic or contractual exchange. The violent consequences of sisters are usually replaced by petty jealousy, not attempted murder. The trick to the underworld becomes metaphoric rather than literal. In short, what remains in children's versions is the redemptive arc. Love heals the beast, while much of the social architecture that made the original tales function as adult instruction or ritual is removed. Before we move on to the Brazilian record collected by Lindolfo Gomes, and before we fully unpack Villeneuve and Beaumont side by side, it's important to linger on what this pattern implies about function. When the tale centers on bargains, secrecy, and trials involving death or serious coercion, the audience is being asked to engage with the realities and dangers of adult social life. The story functions, in those moments, less as entertainment and more as a cultural rehearsal. It dramatizes what marriage could demand and what penalties could follow from failing to respect or navigate social obligations. Those narratives afforded adults a way to talk about what marriage could cost, what could go wrong, and what rituals might restore order. That interpretive frame, reading these motifs as initiation rites or as social instruction, does not exhaust what the tales can mean. It is, however, a plausible reading that the motifs consistently support. Even more, it helps explain why later versions deliberately remove or soften certain elements. As the intended audience shifted toward children, editors and adapters began to recast dangerous or ambiguous motifs into lessons about virtue and inner worth, neutralizing the more troubling aspects of the social critique. Now, cross the ocean and the centuries to Brazil in the early 20th century, where Lindolfo Gomes recorded a popular variant, published in collections around 1918 and 1939. This version deserves attention precisely because it demonstrates that the same structural concerns persisted outside of Europe and well into the modern period. Gomez's tale resembles Beaumont's form in its concision, but it retains adult elements that remind us of the older lineage. The father's vow or promise that places a daughter at risk is present. The daughter's voluntary or coerced sacrifice is narratively visible. Sister's malice and near-lethal abandonment reappear, and the threat of death or permanent loss is rarely absent. In short, even in oral variants where simplification occurs, the adult stakes survive. The persistence of these motifs in folk traditions suggests they speak to common social problems: marriage as an economic and social contract, jealousy as a destructive social force, and the bride's initiation into a new household as a risky adult passage.
Consider for a moment the emotive weight of a tale in which a father, reduced to dire circumstance, promises a daughter to a supernatural or monstrous suitor. For modern readers, the image is jarring. For earlier audiences, it likely conveyed a familiar moral calculus. Honor and survival sometimes require painful bargains. That calculus is not easily taught to children without significant moral framing. It is the kind of thing that adults discuss in hushed tones or encode in stories meant to instruct the young by proxy. This helps explain why the tale travels into the children's canon only after adapters reshape it. The cumulative effect of these witnesses, Apuleius, Straparola, Villeneuve, Beaumont, and Lindolfo Gomes, is a compelling case that Beauty and the Beast's ancestors operate in adult registers. But proving the point requires more than listing motifs. We also need to consider why such themes would have been encoded into a story in the first place. One plausible explanation is that tales like this functioned as forms of social pedagogy. They modeled what to fear and how to recover. Keep your wits in the marital bargain,
beware of jealous kin, trust cautiously, and expect trials that change you. Another explanation frames the stories as ritual narratives. They dramatize rites of passage into marriage, where symbolic death and rebirth are central. Both readings are interpretive strategies, useful, I think, because they account for the recurrence of trials, secrecy, and coercion across widely separated versions. But let's not be too tidy. These approaches are readings, not certainties. They help us make sense of consistent motifs, but they do not fix the tale's meaning once and for all. What the textual record does offer, fairly clearly, is a trajectory. Stories with adult concerns precede and undergird the sanitized versions. To recognize that is not to indict contemporary adaptations, but to complicate how we view them. The children's story we know is the product of editing, reframing, and cultural choice. With that context in hand, we come back to 18th century France and begin to untangle Villeneuve and Beaumont more thoroughly. Villeneuve's version insists on courtly detail and moral ambiguity, and it includes a subplot in which a fairy, an adult figure with erotic and coercive power, attempts to seduce or manipulate members of the court. This introduces an explicitly adult register of desire and political power into the tale. The enchanted servants in Villeneuve's palace are not merely whimsical objects, they are people under a spell, their transformations tied to the moral economy of the narrative. The palace itself, full of living discomfort and ambiguous social relations, reads as a micro-society where adult vices and virtues play out on a grand stage. By contrast, Beaumont streamlines. She tightens the narrative focus on the heroine's moral qualities and frames the beast as a test of inner goodness.
The text loses some of Villeneuve's complexity, its ambiguous enchantments and seduction subplot, yet it does not entirely sever the story from adult concerns. The father's vow, the sisterly malice, and the theme of sacrifice all remain in some form. Beaumont's editorial move is therefore a strategic one, sanitization through compression rather than complete erasure. We are already seeing why the tale moves toward children's literature. Editors find ways to preserve the uplift, where patience, virtue, and love redeem, while downplaying the messier infrastructures that made the story a vehicle for adult anxieties. But this process was neither uniform nor instantaneous. Villeneuve's text reminds us that the story can be stubbornly adult in its implications, and oral variants, like those recorded by Lindolfo Gomez, show the tale's persistent cross-cultural adult resonance. Pause here for a moment and consider a simple question. Why do we, as a culture, prefer the softened tale? The answer is practical. Stories taught to children in domestic settings often carry explicit moral lessons we want to instill: kindness, bravery, loyalty. Tales of bargaining and near death, of fathers' terrible promises and sisters' murderous envy, complicate those messages. A narrative that requires adults to explain the social calculus behind marriage is harder to convert into a simple parable. Thus, editors and illustrators isolate and amplify elements that resonate with the values they want to teach, while minimizing the parts that demand uncomfortable historical context. We are at a crossroads. We've traced a line from Apuleius's ancient initiation drama through Strapolorla's bodily transactional version and reached the bifurcation in 18th century France that begins to produce a child-friendly shape. We've touched on the Brazilian variant that shows how resilient the older motifs are. What remains open is a deeper excavation of those adult motifs, how marriage as commerce, secrecy in the marital bed, institutional coercion, and punitive justice for offending sisters work differently across versions, and a focused look at how and why Disney-style adaptations selectively translated those motifs into animated symbolism. That comparative work will involve close readings, examples that show with granular detail how a marriage vow that could cost a daughter's life is narrated in Villeneuve versus in Lindolfo Gomez, how the unseen husband functions as initiation in Apuleius more than as mere mystery in Beaumont, and how Strapolorla's violent domestic scenes underlie the tale's bodily stakes. It will also mean naming what modern versions remove, and why those removals matter for how we teach and watch the story today. But before we dig into those next steps, let's linger on one complicating factor. The very features that mark the tale as adult, sexual secrecy, threats, coercive bargains, are also the features that make it profoundly flexible as a story.
They invite adaptation because they pose big moral problems: how to reconcile duty and desire, how to live with a spouse you do not understand, how to confront powerful forces, divine or social, that shape your fate. Because these are universal human problems, storytellers can recast them across genres and audiences. An adult could hear Apuleius and come away with a narrative about religious contest between gods, while a later adaptator could strip the text and recast it as a parable about inner goodness. That variety is why tracing the genealogy matters. It shows not only where the tale came from, but also the choices adapters made about what to foreground and what to forget. We still have to look at specific scenes that signal adultness most clearly. The father's vow that places a daughter at mortal risk, the scene of the unseen husband in the marital bed, the sister's attempt to harm or abandon the heroine, and the descent into the underworld. Each of these scenes, when read literally, presupposes a social context where such acts are meaningful and understandable to adults. The next section will take these scenes in order and show how they function in Apuleius, in Straparola, in Villeneuve, and in Lindelfulgams. We'll pay particular attention to how adapters could either preserve the danger, and thus the adult audience, or neutralize it for a juvenile one. So far, we've built the case that the tale's ancestors speak to adult markets: marriage, honor, bodily shame, and ritual transformation. We have more evidence ahead, close textual moments across versions that make the adult logic palpable. We'll compare and contrast those moments, and then move on to how later adaptations, particularly modern children's versions, systematically recode them into safer, more didactic narratives. The implications are both scholarly and practical. Knowing this lineage changes how we teach the tale, how we stage it, and how we understand its moral lessons. Keep that in mind as we continue. The next scenes we'll examine are some of the starkest, the ones that force a reader to decide whether this is a bedtime story or a cautionary tale for grown people who make painful bargains. Let's take those stark scenes in order: the father's bargain, the unseen husband in the marital bed, the sister's violence, and the descent to the underworld, and look at how each one works differently across Apuleius, Straparola, Villeneuve, Beaumont, and Lindelfulgams. Each scene is a kind of litmus test for whether a version of the tale speaks to grown-up social realities or to a simplified didactic imaginary. The father's bargain. Apuleius. In Cupid and Psyche, there is a kind of cosmic bargain rather than a mundane one. Psyche's beauty attracts divine wrath, and her family is forced into a situation they never wanted. The way the story frames the family's decision, giving the daughter into the orbit of a fearsome fate, reads like pressure placed on an adult household.
It's not an exchange recorded casually. It's a moral and social crisis. The family must make a choice under duress. The stakes are existential rather than merely sentimental. Straparola. Here, the economic and transactional shape is more explicit and more humiliating. In the Pig King stories, the father's role is often that of negotiator or victim of circumstances, a man who consents, under pressure or for payment, to his daughter's marriage to a beast. That consent can be portrayed as pragmatic, survival, debt relief, or coerced, threats, magical compulsion. Either way, the choice is framed as a social calculation. What will preserve the family? The narrative thereby forces adult readers to face the unpleasant fact that marriage has long been, for many, part of a family's strategy rather than simply a romantic culmination. Villeneuve. In Villeneuve's expanded courtly world, paternal obligations are bound up with lineage, honor, and political advantage. A father's promise here is rarely just private. It has public consequences for reputation and inheritance. When a patriarch makes a vow, or when a parent's error sends a daughter into strange hands, the resulting predicament maps onto courtly anxieties about alliances and status. Villeneuve maintains the adult stakes by making such bargains part of a larger social web. Beaumont and Lindelfulgams. Beaumont trims many elaborate justifications but keeps the outline. A parent's promise that endangers a daughter remains legible. Lindelfulgams' Brazilian variant demonstrates that this bargain motif survives in folk contexts, where economic hardship and family strategy give the motif an immediate emotional charge. Even when the text is made concise, the father's role as someone who can trade his daughter, literally or symbolically, marks the story with an adult preoccupation. Who controls marriage decisions and at what moral cost? Why does the father's bargain mark the tale as adult? Because it presupposes a social economy where marriage is a resource or a liability, and where decisions are made by adults for adults. It presumes an audience acquainted with household negotiation, debts, dowries, survival strategies, not a child's naive imagination of love arriving magically. The unseen husband and the marital bed. Apuleius. The bed scene in Cupid and Psyche is crucial. The husband is present at night. He is denied to the bride as an object of sight. The nocturnal union structures the marriage around secrecy. When Psyche breaks the rule and looks, the result is catastrophic. The act of seeing functions as both transgression and right.
Interpreters often read this as an initiation. The unseen husband enforces boundaries of knowledge, intimacy, and trust that require negotiation to cross. But the scene also stages adult fears about sexual knowledge, curiosity, and the limits of marital autonomy. Straparola. The pig king intensifies the bodily facts.
The bride's aversion to the pig's body and the way she copes with the husband's animality, sometimes through violence or flight, make the marital bed an explicitly carnal and uncomfortable place. There is less of the ritual mystery found in Apuleius, and more of an emphasis on bodily repulsion, negotiation, and the possibility of coerced intimacy. That is, the bed is not simply mysterious, it is an occupied site where adult bodies and desires collide awkwardly, and sometimes cruelly. Villeneuve. Villeneuve preserves the erotic and the ambiguous. The beast's household, the enchanted servants, the late-night visits, all this is set in a courtly context where sexual competition, seduction, and reputation are easily endangered. The unseen husband motif there can be mediated by powers, fairies, curses, politics, that read as adult concerns about consent, status, and the manipulation of desire. Beaumont. Beaumont neutralizes much of the sexual charge. The unseen husband remains a device, an element of mystery, but it is reframed so that the heroine's patience and charity are what matter most. The moral emphasis reduces the scene's adult erotic ambiguity, transforming it into an opportunity to instruct children in virtues, rather than to stage the complex tensions of privacy and power in adult unions. Lindolfo Gomes. The Brazilian versions keep the core tension. The young woman must share a space with an enigmatic consort. The rules that govern that sharing are risky and meaningful. In oral storytelling, where certain explicit descriptions may be muted, the scene nevertheless carries an emotional weight for adult listeners who know what it means to adapt to a new household and new intimacies. Why does this matter? Because in versions where the bed scene is experientially adult, the tale asks readers to consider sexual boundaries, trust, and the negotiation of physical intimacy, topics that require adult interpretive resources. In versions where the scene is reframed as a moral test, those complications are made child-appropriate. Sisters' violence and intra-family rivalry. Across almost every early variant, the figure of the jealous sister or sisters is central. Their malice often catalyzes the heroine's fall. Apuleius. Psyche's sisters are active agents of deception. They envy her and lure her into transgression. Their betrayal is not framed as mere antiness. It is an existential threat that triggers exile and arduous trials. That kind of sibling malice participates in adult anxieties about succession, dowries, and intra-family competition for resources or advantageous marriages. Straparola. The Pig King tales sometimes include darker actions, brides attempting to abandon or kill the monstrous husband. Kinship can be violent. Violence between adults is foregrounded.
When sisters conspire to push a sibling into harm's way, the narrative presumes an audience that understands the stakes of kinship rivalry, inheritance, social standing, and the very material consequences of a marriage gone wrong. Villeneuve and Beaumont. Villeneuve's sisters and rival figures are woven into courtly plots where jealousy has broader political and reputational consequences. Beaumont preserves the motif in a simplified form. Sisters' envy produces humiliation and sometimes exile, but the emphasis shifts to the heroine's response. Lindolfo Gomes, again, shows that these dynamics are not merely European elite concerns. The potential for destructive sibling rivalry exists across social contexts. Why is this adult stuff? Because intrafamilial malice in these tales is rarely about childish spite. It typically reflects structural pressures, scarcity, competition for marriage partners, inheritance law. These are adult matters. In versions oriented to adults, the violence is a way of traumatizing those pressures. In versions adapted for children, the violence is softened into moral lessons about envy and forgiveness. The descent to the underworld and near-death ordeals. Among the oldest and most provocative elements is the heroine's descent, literal or figurative, into death-like domains. Apuleius. Psyche's task to visit the underworld and return with an object she is forbidden to open is perhaps the most starkly adult plot point. A journey to Hades is not a whimsical errand. It is a liminal passage that dramatizes death, endurance, and the risk of permanent loss. That motif sits well with initiation or ritual reading, a symbolic death and rebirth that prepares the protagonist for new status. It is also a narrative of extreme adult endurance. The heroine must engage with the deepest mysteries of mortality and duty. Straparola, trials in Pig King variants may be less mythic and more practical, survival tasks, domestic manipulations, but their seriousness is clear because they often involve potential death, abandonment, or long-term suffering. The focus on bodily exposure and the logistics of living with an unacceptable spouse turn trials into matters of survival. Villeneuve keeps high-stakes trials and inserts them into a world where magic, seduction, and politics operate on adult scales. Tasks may be moral and social as much as they are physical. They test honor as well as endurance. Beaumont's simplification again diminishes the mythic quality of the underworld descent. Tasks remain, but their symbolic weight is reduced in favor of moral clarity. The heroine's endurance becomes exemplary rather than initiatory. Lindolfo Gomez. The folk variants recorded by Lindolfo Gomez often preserve the sense of real danger. Trials in oral contexts, whether framed as symbolic or literal, resonate because listeners may recognize the precariousness of women's lives and social positions in their own worlds.
A task that risks death is not rhetorical flourish in folk memory. It is a profound narrative that acknowledges adult vulnerability. Across these four motifs, then, there is a consistent pattern. The story's machinery assumes adult social realities. When any one of these elements is prominent, the tale is addressing concerns adults are already equipped to parse. This is the crux of the argument that the story was not originally meant for children. Its earliest and most compelling versions are saturated with scenarios that make sense and perhaps function as adult social pedagogy. How modern children's versions rewrite the adult tale. We can now map what modern, especially post-Enlightenment and commercial popular, adaptations do to these elements. Sanitization of bargaining. The father's bargain, when it survives in children's adaptations, becomes a sacrifice motivated by love rather than by market or survival calculus. Where an early version might make a father's promise the result of debt or desperate bargaining, a children's retelling recasts the same exchange as a noble act of filial devotion, thus erasing the transactional unpleasantness. Neutralization of nocturnal intimacy. The unseen husband motif loses its adult erotic charge in modern retellings. Secrecy becomes romantic mystery. The bed becomes a stage for eventual romantic revelation, rather than a locus of power asymmetry or initiation. The tension between consent and ignorance is softened into a narrative payoff. Surprise becomes attraction rather than transgression. Domesticating sibling rivalry. Sisterly malice is reduced from potentially murderous conspiracy to moral failing that can be promptly forgiven. Where older versions used sibling violence to dramatize stakes, later retellings use sibling rivalry as a teaching moment about envy and humility. Metaphorizing underworld descent. Underworld trials are reframed as emotional growth or simplified tasks. The descent to Hades becomes a metaphor for personal testing rather than a literal brush with death. The terrifying cosmic scale of older tests is scaled down into child-appropriate obstacles. Replacing terror with whimsy, enchanted households with tormented servants become animated spectacle, talking teapots, friendly clocks, so that fear or oppression is transmuted into enchantment that excites rather than alarms. The instruments of magical coercion in older versions are remodeled as comic relief or helpful allies. Why these changes happen? Practical, ideological, and commercial reasons. Practical. Parents and educators prefer tales that inculcate virtues without exposing children to the most disturbing moral ambiguities of adult life. Ideological. Child-rearing discourses of the 18th and 19th centuries promoted a specific set of moral lessons, temperance, obedience, domesticity, that required pruning morally messy content. Commercial. Publishers know what sells.
A romance that promises safe redemption and straightforward morals will be easier to package, illustrate, and market to families. But this process is not merely excision, it is also translation. Adapters did not always mean to lie about the tale's past. They often meant to repurpose its moral energy for different social goals, schooling the young, building national literatures, or creating profitable entertainment. In each of those moves, elements that were once instruments of adult instruction are given new functions. Can the original adult readings be reconciled with modern appeal? Yes, and here is an important nuance. The fact that older variants are adult does not invalidate the emotional power of modern versions. The core narrative, loss, transformation, recognition, speaks to human experience at multiple life stages. What changes is the aspect of human life being addressed. An adult hearing Apuleius might focus on ritual identity and social obligation. A child hearing a bedtime version will learn patience and kindness. Both experiences are valid, but they are not the same. What matters for cultural literacy is being aware of those differences. If educators and parents know that the tale contains adult strata, they can choose versions and context deliberately. For instance, when teaching the tale to older adolescents, a class discussion can unpack what the father's bargain tells us about historical marriage markets. For younger children, a simplified text may be appropriate, provided caregivers are ready to answer questions honestly if they arise. Practical examples of reframing. Villeneuve versus Beaumont. Reading the two side by side offers a useful exercise. A class could read Villeneuve to see an expanded courtly world where seduction, lineage, and enchanted punishment raise complex ethical questions, then read Beaumont and ask how and why she excises certain elements to make a moral fable. That comparison exposes editorial choices and helps students think about adaptation as an ideological act. Apuleius in undergraduate classrooms. A close reading of the underworld descent scene can open discussions about ritual, gendered transformations, and cultural anxieties about beauty and power. The scene's seriousness prompts conversations about how myths function in societies that must regulate marriage and desire. Lindolfo Gomes in comparative folklore. Including the Brazilian variant complicates the narrative history by reminding listeners that the tale's adult features were not confined to European literary elites. Folk variants show how structural motifs persist in oral culture because they address lived dangers and worries. This can enrich cross-cultural discussions about how social pressures shape stories. Why this history matters now. Understanding the tale's adult origins reframes our expectations. It helps explain why the plot can be read so many ways, why it was so attractive to adapters, and why it continues to be emotionally resonant.
It also matters ethically. When a narrative has historically been used to justify or to warn about coercive practices, we should be cautious about unreflectively promoting a sanitized version as innocent. That's not to say the modern versions must be condemned. They perform different cultural work, but awareness of lineage encourages nuance. For instance, if a teacher assigns Disney's film as a cultural artifact, pairing it with a discussion of older texts, Villeneuve or a folktale version, can reveal the choices behind the adaptation. It gives viewers vocabulary to ask whether the transformation into kid-friendly form erased morally relevant questions, and whether the new form serves a pedagogical aim or a commercial one. A final thought about transformation. The beast's turning back into a prince is often read as moral recompense. Love redeems. But that metamorphosis is also social restoration. An enchanted or outcast noble regains his place in society, and the heroine's acceptance rehabilitates a troubled household. In adult versions, that restoration often comes after tests demonstrating social worth. In children's versions, it is often framed as emotional awakening. Both readings are meaningful. Neither is exclusive. Noting the difference, however, is important if we want to understand what the tale has done historically. It regulated social norms as much as it comforted lonely hearts. What to watch for when you next see a Beauty and the Beast? When the tale is presented as a children's romance, look for what's present and what's absent. Does the adapter mention the circumstances of the bargain that brings the heroine to the beast? Are the servants merely whimsical, or are they symbolic of social entrapment? Is the beast's ugliness ever linked to social dishonor or to actual bodily repulsion? How are the sisters portrayed? Petty rivals, or agents of near-fatal betrayal? Noticing those choices will sharpen your sense of how much adaptation matters. A final interpretive caution. We must resist two temptations. First, it is tempting to scour older texts for only grim meanings, to insist the tale proves something cynical about human nature. Second, it is tempting to sentimentalize the modern versions as harmlessly progressive. Both reactions flatten complexity. The better move is interpretive humility. Acknowledge multiple readings, point to evidence when claiming an interpretation is plausible, and admit where the textual record is ambiguous. That approach respects both the historical materials and our contemporary sensibilities. Conclusion. Why Beauty and the Beast was never meant for kids, as a claim and as a corrective. The claim in the title, Why Beauty and the Beast was never meant for kids, is intentionally provocative. It asks us to consider provenance and function.
The evidence surveyed, Apuleius's ritualized initiation, Straparola's bodily and transactional pig king, Villeneuve's courtly complexity, Beaumont's selective sanitization,
And Lindolfo Gomez's persistence of adult motifs in oral tradition shows a clear pattern. The tale emerges and circulates in registers that presume adult experience: bargaining, sexual secrecy, sibling rivalry with lethal potential, and tasks that verge on death. That does not mean no one ever told simplified versions to children before the modern era. It does mean, however, that the central, most ancient motifs of the tale are not native to nursery culture. The tale's migration into children's literature is a product of editorial choices and changing social priorities, choices that smoothed rough edges, reframed bargains as noble sacrifices, and recast initiation as personal growth. Recognizing that history changes how we watch and teach the story. It invites us to be more deliberate. If we choose to present the tale to children, we can select versions that suit our educational aims and be ready to contextualize them. If we are watching adaptations as adults, we can appreciate both the film's artistry and the selective remaking of older materials. The past does not bind the present, but it enriches it. The deeper you know where a tale came from, the more you can appreciate what its adapters chose to keep, and why. If this historical route through the tale surprised you, take a look at some of the sources linked below, and if you want, watch the episode where I compare Villeneuve's longer text line by line with Beaumont's abridgment. Knowing the versions sharpens your reading of even the most sanitized retellings. Check the description for those references and for recommended editions of Apuleius, Straparola, Villeneuve, Beaumont, and Lindolfo Gomez. If you found this useful, watch the related video on fairy tale origins for a deeper dive into how other well-known tales were also refashioned for children.